The morning of my wedding, I stood in the parking lot of St. Andrew's Church in a dress I had altered 3 times, holding a bouquet of white peonies my best friend Maya had driven 2 hours to deliver. The October air was cold enough to see my breath. I kept checking my phone. Nothing. Not a text. Not a missed call. Not even a thumbs up on the photo I had sent my mother the night before me in the dress, hair half pinned, smiling at the mirror like everything was fine. I told myself they were just running late. My father was always late. My mother always forgot something at the house and made everyone turn back. My brother Marcus probably overslept. This was just them being them. But 40 minutes later, when the organist inside had looped the same prelude 3 times, and the pastor had quietly closed the side door to keep out the wind, I understood. They weren't late. They weren't coming. I put the phone in my bouquet hand, straightened my back, and walked through those doors alone. Daniel was standing at the altar. He saw my face before I reached the first pew. He didn't say anything right away. He just stepped forward, past the pastor, past the candles, and met me halfway down the aisle. He took my hand and walked back up with me. Our 26 guests were silent. Maya, in the front row, had her hand over her mouth. That was the moment I knew 2 things at once. I had married the right man. And I had been trying to love the wrong family into showing up for me for my entire life. My name is Claire. I'm 31 years old. I'm a firefighter engine company, 7, out of Portland, Oregon. I've pulled people out of burning buildings, carried a 70-year-old man down 4 flights of stairs, and held the hand of a woman trapped in her car after a highway accident while we waited for the jaws of life. I've been told I'm calm under pressure, steady, hard to rattle. My father raised me to be exactly that kind of person. He just never expected it to be used against him. Growing up, my dad was the kind of man who filled every room he walked into. He was a high school football coach for 22 years. Loud voice, firm handshake, the type of person other people's kids called sir without being asked. In our house on Birchwood Lane, what he said was the weather. It determined everything. Whether dinner was quiet or tense. Whether my mother hummed while she cooked or kept her eyes down. Whether Marcus and I played outside after school or went straight to our rooms. I loved him the way you love a force of nature. Without really having a choice, my mother was softer in private and invisible in public. Around my father, she became a different woman, smaller, quicker to agree, always smoothing things over. I used to think she was just easygoing. It took me until my mid-20s to understand she was just tired. Marcus was the golden one. 3 years younger than me, built like my father, laughed like him too. He could do no wrong. Every report card, every game, every stumble, Marcus got the benefit of the doubt. I got the lesson. I'm not saying my childhood was terrible. There were good years. Summers at my grandfather's place on the coast. Friday night dinners. My dad teaching me to drive in an empty church parking lot, both of us laughing when I rolled over a traffic cone. Those things were real, but so was this. When I was 17 and told my father I wanted to become a firefighter, he looked at me across the dinner table like I had said something in a foreign language. Then he laughed. Not cruelly, just dismissively. The kind of laugh that meant the conversation was over. Women don't do that, he said, and reached for the salt. I became a firefighter anyway. I met Daniel at a mutual friend's birthday party when I was 27. He was a structural engineer, quiet, precise, the kind of person who noticed things other people missed. On our 3rd date, he told me he had looked up the load-bearing capacity of the restaurant ceiling out of habit. I told him I had clocked the 2 fire exits and the sprinkler coverage radius when we walked in. We both laughed. We understood each other immediately. When I brought him home to meet my parents for the first time, my father shook his hand for exactly 2 seconds and spent the rest of dinner asking Daniel questions about his firm, his salary projections, where he saw himself in 10 years, the same way he'd interview a player asking for more field time. Daniel answered everything patiently, politely, without flinching. I watched my father recalibrate. He never fully approved. But he tolerated. The first real break came 18 months before the wedding. Daniel and I had gotten engaged in July. Small ring, big moment he proposed on the hiking trail, where we'd had our first real conversation about our families, which felt exactly right. I called my mother that evening, voice shaking with happiness. She congratulated me warmly. Then she passed the phone to my father. There was a pause before he spoke. I could hear the television in the background. "You're going to want a church wedding," he said. Not a question. We haven't decided anything yet, I said. Street Michaels. Your grandfather was married there. It's what we do. Dad, Daniel and I are going to figure out what works for us. Another pause. Longer this time. You know, a woman your age, in your line of work, men like that want a certain kind of wife. I asked him what that meant. He didn't answer directly. He just said, I hope you know what you're doing, and handed the phone back to my mother. I told Daniel about it that night. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You know, we don't have to involve them in the planning if it's going to look like that. I said I wanted to try. That was my mistake. Not in trying, but in thinking trying harder would change anything. Over the next several months, every conversation with my father about the wedding became a negotiation I hadn't agreed to enter. The venue, the date, the guest list. Whether Daniel's parents, who were Korean American, kind, wonderful people who had welcomed me immediately, would feel comfortable at a Catholic ceremony. My father had opinions about all of it, delivered not as suggestions but as corrections. I accommodated where I could. I offered Street Andrews instead of Street Michaels. I agreed to a Saturday in October. I invited every family friend my mother mentioned. What I wouldn't agree to was the officiant. My father wanted his old pastor, a man I barely knew who had given a sermon at a family friend's wedding 3 years earlier, that had made Daniel's mother quietly excuse herself. I said no. My father called it disrespectful. I said choosing our own officiant for our own wedding wasn't disrespect. It was a basic decision. He said I was acting like my family didn't matter to me. I told him the opposite was true, which is exactly why I was trying to have this conversation, instead of just doing what I wanted without consulting anyone. He hung up. 2 weeks before the wedding, my mother called me. I could tell by her voice she had rehearsed what she was going to say. Your father isn't going to come, Claire. I sat down on my kitchen floor. I don't know why. My legs just decided we were done standing. He says he can't support the wedding. And I have to stand by him. You understand? I asked about Marcus. She said Marcus felt the same way. I stayed on the floor for a long time after we hung up. Daniel found me there when he got home. He didn't ask questions right away. He just sat down next to me, right there on the kitchen tiles, and put his arm around me and let me cry. When I was done crying, I made a decision. I was not going to cancel. I was not going to beg, and I was not going to let what they chose to do on my wedding day take even 1 hour away from what that day was supposed to be. The wedding was small and beautiful. 26 people who wanted to be there. Maya walked with me to the doors and then squeezed my hand and slipped into the front pew. Daniel met me halfway, like I told you. The pastor we had chosen, a woman named Reverend Dawes, who had known Daniel's family for years, gave a homily about choosing love as an act of courage. I cried twice. Daniel cried once and pretended he didn't. We danced in the reception hall until 10:30 at night, and Daniel's father taught Maya's husband a Korean wedding game that involved a lot of chopsticks and everyone losing. It was one of the best days of my life. 31 days later, I got a text from my father. It was long for him. He didn't usually text. I could tell my mother had probably helped. It said that Marcus's engagement had been finalized, and the wedding was being planned for the following spring. It said the venue they'd chosen was going to cost more than expected. It asked if I could contribute $9,200 toward the catering deposit as a wedding gift to my brother, and said the family would appreciate it given how much they had invested in me over the years. I read it 3 times. Then I read it out loud to Daniel. He looked at me for a long moment and then said, "What do you want to do?" I thought about it for exactly 48 hours. Then I sent my father a Venmo payment of $1. In the memo line I wrote, "Congratulations to the happy couple. Wishing Marcus all the best." I did not respond to the text. Then I called our building manager and asked about changing the garage door code and the front door lock. Not because I thought anyone would show up, just because I needed to feel like the boundary I'd drawn had a physical form. The calls started 3 days later. My father, twice a day. My mother, once in the morning. Marcus once, which surprised me. We had never been close enough to fight about money before. I let them all go to voicemail. The messages were variations on the same theme. I was being immature. I was punishing the family for a personal disagreement. Marcus had nothing to do with the wedding situation, and it wasn't fair to penalize him. One of my father's messages used the word selfish 4 times in 90 seconds. I counted. I didn't respond. Then, on a Thursday afternoon in December, I came home from a 48-hour shift to find a Portland Police Department cruiser parked in front of my building. I walked up in my work jacket, still carrying my gear bag, and 2 officers met me on the steps. They were professional, calm. They said they had received a report of a stolen item specifically, a piece of jewelry described as a family heirloom allegedly taken from my parents' home during my last visit. My last visit had been 8 months ago, at Easter, before the engagement. I stood there on my front steps, exhausted down to my bones, and I asked the officers if they wanted to come inside and sit down while I explained the situation. I pulled up the photos on my phone, all the Easter photos, time-stamped, none of them showing me anywhere near my mother's jewelry box. I told them clearly and calmly that I had not been in my parents' home since April, that there had been a significant family dispute over my wedding, and that this appeared to be a harassment strategy. I was polite. I was a city employee. I knew exactly how to speak to law enforcement because I worked alongside them regularly. The officers listened, asked a few questions, wrote some things down. Before they left, one of them, a woman, maybe 40, looked at me with an expression that wasn't quite sympathy and wasn't quite professional neutrality. It was something in between. "You have a good evening," she said. I went inside, put my gear bag down, sat at the kitchen table, and called Daniel. He was in Seattle for work. I told him everything in the flattest possible voice, because if I let any inflection into it, I was going to start shaking. He drove home that night, left his work trip a day early, drove 4 hours, walked in at 11:30 p.m. and put a bowl of soup in front of me that he had somehow made from what was in our refrigerator. I don't know how he does that. I married the right man. We talked until 2 in the morning, not just about my father, about all of it, about the pattern, about the way control works in families. About how some people will escalate indefinitely because escalation is the only language they know when compliance stops. I said I was done. Done responding, done hoping, done leaving the door open in case things changed. Daniel nodded. "Okay," he said. "Then we're done." I blocked my father's number. My mother's. Marcus's. I felt guilty for about a week. Then I felt quiet. Then I felt, for the first time in as long as I could remember, like the inside of my own life was actually mine. What I didn't know was that 6 months later, everything would shift again. The call came from a number I didn't recognize on a Sunday morning in June. I almost didn't pick up. Something made me answer. It was my Aunt Patricia, my father's older sister. She sounded careful on the phone. She told me my father had had a stroke. He was in Providence Street, Vincent Medical Center. He was stable, but the right side of his body was affected, and his speech was impaired. My mother was there. Marcus was flying in. I sat with the information for a moment. Then I thanked my aunt for calling. I didn't go that day. I didn't go the next day either. I talked to Daniel. I talked to Maya. I talked to a counselor I had started seeing in the spring, a practical, no-nonsense woman named Dr. Ellison who had a gift for asking the question you didn't know you needed to hear. She asked me, "What would you regret?" Not what would your father think, or your family, or anyone watching. What would you, Claire, be carrying in 10 years? I went on the 3rd day. My mother was in the hallway outside his room. She looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically, she'd always been slight, but somehow less solid, like some internal scaffolding had shifted. She saw me walking toward her, and her face did something complicated that I didn't have a word for. We hugged. It was not a warm hug. It was 2 people holding each other up. She told me he'd been asking for me. She said this quietly, without editorializing, without making it a manipulation. Just a fact. I went in. My father was in the bed with monitors attached and a call button in his left hand and half his face not moving quite right. He was 63 years old and he looked, for the first time in my memory, like he didn't know what to do with a room he was in. He looked at me. His right eye didn't track quite the way his left did. I sat down in the chair next to the bed. We stayed like that for a while. The monitors beeped. Someone in the hallway laughed at something. Outside the window, Portland was doing what Portland does in June, half sun, half cloud, changing its mind every 20 minutes. He lifted his left hand toward me. Not reaching. Exactly. More like offering. I put my hand in his. His grip was weaker than I had ever felt it. My father had always had the grip of a man who believed a handshake was a character test. This was different. This was just a hand. He tried to say something. The stroke had affected his speech, and the words came out fragmented, not garbled, just slow. like he was choosing each one carefully from a depleted supply. He said my name. Then he said, "I'm sorry I wasn't there." That's all? 5 words. The most his mouth could manage without exhausting him. I had imagined, many times, what my father apologizing would feel like. I had scripted it in my head during late nights at the station when the bay was quiet. I had imagined feeling vindicated, or relieved, or maybe nothing at all after too much time had passed. What I actually felt was grief. Real, sharp grief. Not for myself exactly, for him. For the 20 years he spent not knowing how to say a thing like that. For all the rooms he'd filled with noise because he didn't know how to fill them with this. I didn't say it's okay because it wasn't, completely. I didn't say I forgive you because I was still working out what that meant. I said, "I know, Dad." And then I stayed. I visited every day for the 11 days he was in the hospital. Not for long each time, an hour, sometimes less. My mother was always there, and we found a strange, neutral ground between us, a temporary suspension of everything unresolved. Marcus arrived on day 4. We didn't talk about the money or the wedding or any of it. We just existed in the hallway over bad coffee and took turns sitting with our father. His speech improved slowly. By day 8 he could make full sentences if he took his time. On day 10, he asked me to tell him about the wedding. The whole thing. So I did. I told him about Maya bringing the peonies. I told him about Daniel meeting me halfway down the aisle. I told him about Reverend Dawes and the homily about courage. I told him about Daniel's father and the chopstick game, and how Maya's husband had knocked an entire plate of rice off the table, and everyone had applauded. My father listened to all of it, with his eyes closed and his good hand folded across his chest. When I finished, he said, "He sounds like a good man." "He is," I said. Then I got that part wrong too. There was nothing to add to that. So I didn't add anything. He was discharged to a rehabilitation facility on day 11. He had a long road ahead: physical therapy, speech therapy, learning to navigate a life where the right side of his body no longer fully cooperated. It would take months. Parts of it would take years. I was not going to be the daughter I had been before all of this. I was not going to erase the year that had happened, the wedding he hadn't come to, the text about Marcus's catering deposit, the police on my front steps. Those things were real, and they had consequences. But I was also not going to be someone who let a stroke become a reason to pretend none of it mattered. What I chose was something harder and more deliberate than either of those things. I chose to be present without losing the ground I had taken. I would visit. I would help coordinate his care. I would be his daughter in the ways that mattered. But I would not go back to the dynamic that had led to all of it in the first place. The money was never mentioned again. Not by my father, not by my mother, not by Marcus. Whether that was because the stroke had recalibrated something, or because they understood I was there on new terms and not the old ones I didn't ask and they didn't explain. Some things resolve quietly. Not neatly. Not completely. Just quietly. Marcus got married that September. I was not in the wedding party. I was not asked to be. I went to the ceremony, sat near the back with Daniel, and wished his new wife well from across a reception hall. And meant it. My father attended in a wheelchair, his left hand on the armrest, my mother sitting beside him. At some point during the reception, he caught my eye from across the room. He lifted his chin slightly, the way he used to when he was acknowledging something he didn't have words for. I nodded back. It wasn't forgiveness all the way. It wasn't a clean slate. It was something more honest than either of those two people seeing each other clearly. Maybe for the first time, across a room full of people who thought they knew our whole story. They didn't. But that was all right. That December, Daniel and I spent Christmas Eve alone in our apartment. We cooked too much food and watched old movies and fell asleep on the couch before midnight. On Christmas morning, I called my mother. We talked for 40 minutes. She asked about work, about the station, about whether we had picked out a couch to replace the one the cat had destroyed. Normal things, small things, the kind of things you can only say when the bigger things have found their level. Before we hung up, she said, "Your father wants me to tell you something." I waited. "He wants you to know he watched the video." "What video?" I asked. "There was a news segment," she said, "about your station. A fire in the Pearl District last spring. They interviewed your captain. They showed footage." I remembered it. A warehouse fire that had gone to 4 alarms. We'd gotten everyone out. "He wants you to know," my mother said carefully, "that he's proud of you. He said he should have said it a long time ago, and he's saying it now. I stood in my kitchen in my pajamas on Christmas morning and pressed my hand flat against the counter and breathed until I was sure my voice was steady. "Tell him I said thank you," I said. After we hung up, I stood at the kitchen window for a while. The street outside was quiet, the way only Christmas morning can be quiet, that specific, particular silence that feels chosen, like the world agreed to pause. A light snow had started sometime in the night. It was still coming down, slow and unhurried, covering everything evenly. Daniel came up behind me with 2 mugs of coffee. He handed me one without saying anything. We stood at the window together and watched the snow. That was enough. That was more than enough. I don't tell this story because it ended perfectly. It didn't. My father is still a difficult man, working hard at rehabilitation and at something else harder to name. My mother is still learning to have opinions in rooms where my father is present. Marcus and I are civil in the way that people can be civil when they've chosen not to dig. There are still dinners that go quiet too fast, and phone calls that take too long to get to the point. But here is what I know. The morning of my wedding, I walked through those doors alone. I was terrified and I kept walking, and the man I had chosen walked toward me, and we met in the middle and we finished that walk together. Nobody gave me away. I was never anyone's to give. I showed up for myself that day, and I have kept showing up for myself every day since. That is the whole story. That is the only story that was ever mine to tell.